From the shores of Britain to the deserts of the Middle East, the Roman Empire once ruled over 60 million people. This was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It was wealthy beyond compare, and its military was almost invincible. But despite its power, wealth, and glory, it would eventually collapse in a matter of only a few decades. How did such an apparently invincible empire suddenly fall apart? To answer this question, today we will explore 10 reasons why Rome fell. 1. The glory of Rome. At its height, Rome was the center of the known world, economically, militarily, and culturally. It was home to the most advanced infrastructure, impressive buildings, world-class art, beautiful statues, magnificent palaces, and sprawling aqueducts. But great wealth and power often come with great problems. And behind Rome's dazzling facade, cracks had already begun to form. As the empire grew, so did its internal complexity, which ultimately led to its downfall. So let's take a look at some of these issues, starting with corruption. 2. Corruption. As the empire expanded, governing over such a large area became increasingly difficult. To make matters worse, ambitious generals and corrupt officials used their positions for personal gain. Bribery, extortion, and tax evasion were widespread. Meanwhile, the wealth gap between the elites and the poor continued to grow, leading to increased social tensions. These issues were made even worse by the fact that Rome's emperors rarely stayed in power for very long. While the position wasn't usually hereditary, emperors would often designate a successor, which resulted in potential power struggles and rebellions. In the 3rd century alone, there were 29 emperors, many of whom took the throne through military force or inheritance disputes. Naturally, this led to all kinds of internal conflict, instability, and general disarray, all of which contributed to the empire's eventual decline. 3. Civil wars. Speaking of succession issues, the constant turnover of emperors also led to frequent civil wars. When someone wanted to become emperor, they usually had to fight for it. This meant that Rome's legions were often called upon to put down rebellions and to choose sides in conflicts. And while Rome was capable of winning wars against external enemies, they weren't always successful in civil conflicts. Many generals saw themselves as potential emperors and would fight to replace the current ruler. This included Septimius Severus, Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, and Elagabalus, just to name a few. Each of these civil wars left the empire weaker and drained its treasury. They also led to even more political instability and economic hardship, which combined to create the perfect conditions for Rome's collapse. For weak leadership, another reason Rome collapsed was due to a series of weak and ineffective leaders. While some emperors like Augustus, Trajan, and Hadrian are remembered as great rulers, others were not so much. One of the worst was Commodus, son and successor of Marcus Aurelius. Commodus was known for his extravagance, incompetence, and cruelty. He appointed unqualified people to influential positions and spent lavishly on gladiatorial games and chariot races. He also antagonized the Senate and alienated many of the empire's most powerful families. Under his rule, Rome lost much of its prestige and power, which made it easier for barbarian tribes to encroach on its borders. Commodus was eventually murdered by his own mother, and the empire was passed on to Septimius Severus, who went on to restore order and stability. But after him, the cycle of incompetent and corrupt rulers continued, contributing to the empire's overall decline. 5. Economic collapse. For centuries, Rome enjoyed great wealth and prosperity. But starting in the 3rd century, its economy began to collapse. This was due to a combination of factors, including heavy taxation, inflation, and a reliance on slave labor. Rome's vast empire required a huge bureaucracy to administer it, and that bureaucracy needed to be paid. But as the economy weakened, the tax burden became too heavy for the people to bear. Prices began to rise, making it even harder for the poor to pay their taxes. Meanwhile, the wealthy began to evade taxes through bribery and other means. This economic crisis was made even worse by the fact that Rome relied heavily on slave labor. Slaves were the backbone of its economy, and as the empire grew, it became harder and harder to acquire them. This led to a shortage of labor, which drove up prices even further. So what started as a small economic crisis quickly turned into a full-blown collapse. 6. Social inequality. Part of Rome's economic collapse was caused by growing social inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor continued to widen, and this led to increased tensions and instability. The wealthy elites became increasingly isolated from the rest of society, and the poor became desperate and disillusioned. This created a powder keg just waiting to explode. The wealth disparity also led to decreased loyalty to Rome. As the empire grew, it became less homogeneous and more diverse. As a result, people began to identify more with their local communities rather than with Rome as a whole. This is particularly true of the provinces, where people often felt that Rome's government was corrupt and uncaring. The social breakdown also played a role in the decline of traditional Roman values. Family and community bonds began to weaken, and there was a decline in civic virtue and public service. People became more concerned with their own self-interest and less concerned with the good of Rome. This cultural shift made it easier for Rome's enemies to recruit soldiers and undermine its authority. 7. Military overstretch. The Roman military was once the most powerful fighting force in the world. But as the empire grew, it became increasingly difficult to defend its vast borders. Rome's legions were spread thin and were unable to respond effectively to barbarian incursions. This allowed Germanic tribes and other outsiders to penetrate the empire and sack its cities. What made matters worse was that Rome's military was becoming weaker. Soldiers were increasingly recruited from outside the empire, and many of them lacked loyalty to Rome. In addition to this, Rome's enemies were becoming more sophisticated and better organized. The old strategies and tactics that had worked so well in the past were no longer effective. By the 4th century, Rome's military was in sharp decline, and it was clear that the empire could no longer defend itself. 8 barbarian invasions. Rome's troubles were made even worse by the emergence of new powers in Europe. Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Huns began to push into Roman territory. In 376 AD, the Visigoths invaded the Balkans and settled in Pannonia, present-day Hungary. But when the Emperor Valens refused to grant them citizenship, the Visigoths rebelled. They defeated and killed the emperor at the Battle of Adrianople. In 378 AD, this invasion marked the beginning of the end for Rome. In 410 AD, the Visigoths sacked Rome, stealing treasures and killing thousands. This shocked the civilized world. People couldn't believe that Rome, the greatest city in the world, could be defeated by barbarians. It seemed like nothing could stop the invaders. And as the years passed, more and more Germanic tribes moved into Italy and other parts of the empire. 9. The Western Empire falls. With Rome's military in sharp decline and barbarian invasions at an all-time high, it didn't take long for the Western Roman Empire to fall. 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. This event is traditionally seen as marking the end of the Western Roman Empire. However, it's important to remember that the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for another 1,000 years. In fact, many historians argue that the fall of Rome was not a single event, but a long, complex process that took place over several centuries. Despite its fall, the Roman Empire left behind a rich legacy that has shaped the modern world. From its contributions to law, language, architecture, and religion, Rome's influence is still felt today. Alright everyone, that's all for this video. Please leave a comment below to let me know what you think. Also, if you haven't already, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.